This is Space Minds by SpaceNews. In this episode, co-host David Ariosto talks with Chinese entrepreneur Yao Song, CEO of Orienspace. We then discuss the latest news, including China's DeepSeek, and wrap up with trivia.
Yao Song, who is the co-founder and CEO of Orienspace, which is one of China's just leading commercial launch companies. You have done a lot in your career. I'm not only talking about development of DeFi tech in Beijing, which has to do with just deep learning, computer technologies, and increasing processing speeds and servers. And you and I have talked about sort of how this actually long-term relates to maybe these broader concepts of even consciousness, but also in the building of your own launch company. I can think of at least one other founder, I'm not naming names here, but from South Africa that started in computer systems, maybe in this case, software development, who then moved into rockets. So I was thinking that might be a good place to start. How has what you have seen at SpaceX and Elon Musk really shaped your path?
Well, actually, that's a big story, I think Elon Musk inspired me and inspired a lot of people, I think, in the world. I think millions of or even more people. First of all, you can see actually, Elon Musk studied physics, but he started his career in, internet. So actually, he did not study aerospace or other related, subjects, majors. So after my first startup, Codify, you can see actually my background is double E, electronic engineering. So I started how to, make EDA software, how to make chips, how to design AI chips. But eventually I found that my dream or my energy are all about space area. But, I'm not quite confident if I can do that. And I think Elon Musk is a really good example that he shows that you can do it. So I think first of all, he inspired me a lot. Besides, when my first startup called DeFi Tech was acquired by Xilinx in 2018. So I was wondering what I should do for my next step for the next decade. So I found the methodology to find all these crucial key problems of mankind. So I divide all these three problems. I divide all these problems into three categories. The first of all is the development of the whole mankind, and then is the survival, health, and happiness of each individual, and then the efficiency of the society. And
so I want to get into all those three, but first I kind of want to get into sort of what started to propel you into sort of that recognition. Because I think at like 22 years old, you were talking about like deep compression techniques and the computational bottlenecks of neural networks when it comes to bandwidth and how that sort of recognition can power AI development and then ultimately led to rockets. But when we talk about your childhood, and that's where I want to start, you grew up with a father. A lot of us have, read like Peppa Pig to our kids. You grew up with a father who's reading Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time as sort of your bedtime reading. That your family wasn't in aerospace, but like, how did that factor your family, those readings, these broader concepts of like the universe in which we live? How did that sort of factor into your educational path that then manifested into these professional aspirations?
Yeah, I think my family, especially my dad, helped me a lot. So both my parents, both my dad and my mom, actually, they were born in the countryside, and my grandparents are farmers or farmers. So, and my dad and my mom also went outside of the countryside, go to university and stay in Changsha city, the capital of Hunan province.
Yeah.
So when I was young, maybe I was just 2 years old or 3 years old, my dad bought me a lot of books. I remember that there are a series of books called 100,000 of Whys, about Earth, about mathematics, about physics, and also about aerospace. So I read that book over and over again, and it turns become broken. And also my dad brought me a series of science, science books. For example, A Brief History of Time, written by Stephen Hawking. So
Well, let's get into Changsha, because I mean that's Hunan province. I think this is really fascinating because this is where Mao Zedong would attend Hunan Teachers College. It's where he became politically active. Many of Mao's generals in the early army came from Hunan. There's a giant statue of young Mao in the city. You yourself have talked about the influence of the military in sort of your early life and how that continues on, sort of your fascination with tanks and planes and all of these things. I'm wondering where you're from, what you saw in terms of growing up, that giant statue, the history of Hunan generally. How did that sort of influence your early life and then sort of manifest in terms of what you're doing with regard to your companies?
Yeah, I think first of all, you can see if I think nearly half of the generals when the People's Republic of China was founded comes from Hunan province.
Yeah.
I think that's because in the I think in 1860s or 1870s there is a Hunan army led by Zheng Guofan. They came back to Hunan and they founded hundreds of schools. So it helped educate a lot of people, including Mao Zedong. So even they're poor, they cannot afford all this cost, but they can go to school freely. So I think first of all, in Hunan province, we emphasize the importance of education a lot. Yeah, so my father and my mother did a lot to support me to pursue a higher degree, to pursue my dream. Besides, you can see a lot of generals from Hunan, especially in Changsha, and there's a National University of Defense Technology also in Changsha. So I think there's quite good atmosphere. You can buy a lot of different books about guns, tanks, aircrafts in the bookstore. Yeah, there are so many comic books and also some.
Well, this is the last question I want to ask you about the books, because I think this is fascinating, because Three Body Problem, that science fiction novel, I think it came out around 2008, if I'm not mistaken. And it was another big influencer. 2008 was just like a formative time in your life, but it was a book. And later it was adapted into a Netflix series. People with varied considerations about that, how that sort of went. But I think at its essence, it sort of brought these frontier concepts in physics to the mainstream in a way that really I haven't seen done much, frankly, in the landscape. Speak to me a little bit about that, the influence of science fiction, because whenever I've talked to other people in the space industry, questions about Star Trek or Star Wars come up, or questions about Jules Verne, or any number one of these sort of sci-fi thrillers have often just sort of spawned this series of things that take place that propel them into the industry. So I'm just curious, when it comes to Three Body Problem, both with your tech company, but also with rockets, like there's a nexus there, is there not?
Yeah. First of all, you can see the first movie I saw ever in my life, I think it's Star Wars. So I'm a big fan of Star Wars. So I was quite attracted by Star Wars. Not just by the newest ones, but also I then found all this episode 1, episode 2, I think that's in 1970s or 1980s, right? So first of all, I think it's truly inspired me to see the wideness of the space and etc. Besides, when I was reading the Three Body Problems, I found that sometimes you are really shocked. For example, in episode 3 of Three Body Problem, so you can see the aliens send an weapon to the solar system to make everything in two-dimensional, make this three-dimensional world into two-dimensional. So there's a note by the author says it reminds me something, which means you cannot see it because it's two-dimensional. It has no height, right? So it cannot stop the light, but you can feel it by gravity. So I think, whoa, I was truly, being shocked, being hit by this note, because it's similar to something like the dark matters, the dark energy and also dark matter. So it make me, still, make me keep my energy and my, pursuing this area. So before the acquisition of DeFi technology, I never thought that I can make a company in this area. I just quite interested in this area, curious about this area. But eventually, when I get the opportunity, I think, oh, that's the time to do it.
Well, I mean, it came out in 2008, and now here we are into 2025, and it seems more than ever, we're seeing this confluence of technologies, whether it's exploration technologies, quantum, AI, even
Yeah.
things like bioengineering, and some of the stuff that we've talked about in terms of some of these neural networks, both in computer systems, but also biological networks that are starting to sort of blend those human computer interfaces in meaningful ways. I wonder, in the context of sort of the here and now, when
Mm-hmm.
when you're overseeing Orion Space,
Mm-hmm.
Gravity 1 had their big launch not too long ago. You're looking at Gravity 2, which is sort of a bigger rocket or launch provider that's meant to rival the Falcon 9. But when you look at these, and you have sort of the broader construct of these mega satellite constellations that are going up, and
Yeah.
how they work with space and stratosphere-based systems and new ecosystems and these ultra-fast networks and AI-powered technologies and Internet of Things, and there's sort of this emerging technosphere that Earth is sort of in the
Yeah.
nascent stages of. Like, where do you play a role in that?
Whoa, that's a really good question and also a big question. Yeah, you can see there are so many changes in different area. For example, in AI, you can see embodied AI like Tesla Optimus 2, like Boston Dynamics, and also you can see a new company called World Labs, founded by Professor Li Feifei in Stanford University.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of changes in this area in large language model in AI, and also you can see a lot of changes in satellite constellation like Starlink, and also the Chinese version Starlink, and you can see Starship is the largest rocket ever we built in human history.
Yeah.
But eventually, I think everything will intersect when you want to immigrate to Mars or to other planet. You can see if you are going to Mars, actually you cannot live on the surface of the Mars, and you cannot, have a lot of people from Earth
These
and then
caves,
go
so
to
to
Mars.
speak, you're talking about the caves underneath.
Yeah, yeah, we need to build the holes, build the caves on Mars. So that's I think why Elon Musk founded Boring Company.
Yeah.
And we need a lot of the robots to dig the holes to, build all these buildings on Mars. So we need
It's interesting how all of these different Musk companies seem to be
Yeah,
oriented in some ways. I mean, sort of the hypothesis that some oriented ways in
yeah,
Mars. I mean, not only in
yeah,
terms of Boring
yeah.
Company, but Neuralink and SpaceX and even Tesla and Solar City and all of these things sort of have foundational building blocks of that which you would need on the red planet. I mean, I imagine there's a very similar tact within China.
Yeah, and you can see China actually. Everyone calls China as the world factory, right? You
Mhm.
can have the most complement supply chain, and when you're building some industrial applications, actually you can achieve the lowest cost in the world. So I think maybe there's a different way to do the similar thing, or we can have different people with the same vision or same dream. So you can do that in United States. I can do this in China. So I think I have a very broad broad background of AI, chip, and for now space, and maybe for the next step for next decades, I will study more about biomedical things.
Right.
So everything intersects. You found that revolutionary innovation comes from all this intersected area, not
Yeah.
just a single department, not double E, not just computer science, but double E plus computer science plus maybe space area, maybe biology, maybe biomedical engineering. All this together, we can make really real revolutionary innovations.
You've talked to me about expanding the circle, so to speak,
Mhm.
right?
Mm.
Why space is important, particularly in the context of finite resources on Earth, growing populations, the nature of sort of the limitations that we may or may not have on this planet, and also how that plays into whether or not there are growing incentives for conflict when it comes to this circle that will or will not be expanded, so to speak. If you can maybe explain that to the audience a bit more.
Yeah. So I just say that I divide all these problems that the mankind need to solve into three categories. The first one is we draw a circle. That's the area that people live. So we need to expand that circle. So we need to, live not just on the surface of Earth, but also on the moon, but also on Mars and even other planets. And within this circle, you can see there are a lot of dots. All these dots are individuals. So I just say there are another category of things to solve this, the survival, health, and happiness of each individual. And then all these dots are connected in this circle. That's the society. So we need to improve the efficiency of the whole society. And especially for the circle thing, you can see when you are running a startup or you're making any plan, you need plan A and plan B, right?
Yeah.
So for each thing, you need a backup plan. So I think for humankind, yeah, we need also a plan B. For example, there is some hypothesis that there's a big filter for every races for each planet. Maybe we will hit that big filter. For example, there are nuclear weapons, nuclear wars, so it erase the surface, the surface of Earth. So we need another planet. So maybe Mars will be the second planet, the plan B of the humankind.
When you talk about sort of the bigger circle, it to me it sort of has there's almost like this tie into Confucian thought in a way, in terms of all these different pillars in terms of happiness and what you've just sort of outlined. And that is a distinctly different sort of perspective and philosophical approach than sort of the the Enlightenment thinkers that came out of sort of the Western approach. So it does seem that, like, not only is this quote unquote space race, and there's different questions about how that sort of manifests. It's not only that it's happening on either sides of the Pacific in a way, but also that there's this a philosophical difference in terms of its approach that are rooted in two very different schools of thought and traditions. And I wonder, like, how that manifests in the cosmos world. Things are heightened. The impacts of all these things are heightened to such an extent, but also whether that space is a zero-sum game, where there's room for sort of coexistence in that sense, whether space is big enough, so to speak, or or it truly will kind of boil down to this geostrategic competition that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I think you just mentioned that. I think the SpaceX race, there's not the zero-sum game, right? So we're not being, so there will be both United States and China and Europe and other countries like India, Japan, Korea, and etc. But you can see that actually SpaceX, I think, is a really expensive area. It costs a lot. For example, if you want to build a rocket like Falcon 9, I think to do the R&D in China, we need to spend over 2 billion Chinese yuan. I think that's over 300 million US dollar. And if you want to build Starship, I think SpaceX spend, I think, over 10 billion US dollars. So if you want to move thousands of people to Mars, to other planets, I think the cost will be trillions or thousands of trillions of US dollars. So I think I found out there are also some other startups.
Is there a market for that? I mean, it's just long term. Is this just not the purview of sort of like governments and because when you start talking those numbers, even sort of the billionaire classes, this is the really mega projects have to have sort of the basis of federal funding. And I just, I wonder about sort of like the long term, when people use terms like lunar economy and Martian economy, it all sounds great and it sounds fascinating and interesting. But until you start to have, sort of that sense of boots on the ground, I wonder what the wherewithal is, both in terms of those markets, but also just like the growth and importance of the commercial sector when it comes to China. So like maybe a question there is like, and this would kind of be the last one here, is like, where do you see all of this going?
You mean the going of the space industry worldwide, or the going of
Yes,
what?
I mean just in terms of the commercial space sector within China, and of which Orionspace is a part. But
Yeah.
if you to kind of look into your crystal ball a little bit and extrapolate down the road, looking at 5, 10 years and sort of looking at these plans that various space agencies are endeavoring on all these different celestial bodies, like where does that put us?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think for next one, I can not speak as the representative, but I can just say my personal
Sure.
comment opinions about that. First of all, I think being the second in this industry, actually we have an advantage. The advantage is that SpaceX shows the right way, the right road towards success, right? So we need to see, oh, okay, Starlink works well. I think Starlink, or we say satellite constellation, satellite internet, will be the most important candidate of 6G network. So I think when Starlink shows the efficiency of Starlink, so China will surely follow this path and build their own satellite internet, right? So we have some, state-owned enterprise doing this, and we also have some private companies like Galaxy Space. They're also doing in this way. Besides, you can see not like in United States, there are both national team and private teams in China. In United States, you can see NASA is not building rockets anymore. So in United States, you have ULA, you have Blue Origin, you have SpaceX and Rocket Labs in New Zealand. And in China, you can see we have our national team and also like our company Orienspace and Space Pioneer, Land Space, and Galactic Energy, and etc. So we will put all this energy together to support the one goal. For example, to build the low orbit satellite internet in the recent 3 to 5 years. So I think for the commercial space industry in China, I think by 2030, maybe together we can have the same capability as that of SpaceX. But it's a combination of both national team and private companies. And I think also by 2030, I think we can build the first generation of Chinese version Starlink. So we have, in China, we have the 60% of 4G or 5G base stations, and then plus 6G, the satellites, we can have a much better communication system, so we can support autonomous, self-driving cars, self-driving, drones, and also you can see all this embodied AI, or we see self-behaving, driving robots. So I think in 5 and 10 years, we can catch SpaceX. But for our company, you can see we are now doing our Gravity 2, the reusable rocket, which is similar to Falcon 9. I think we are going now into the experiment stage, and we are need to do down, I think, over 500 different experiments. For example, running all these engines to see the, for example, some experiments about structure and etc. And I think we are goes into fully prepared. I think by the end of 2025, and we're going to launch that, I think, in next year in 2026. In this year,
Nice.
actually, I think it will be a big year for Chinese space industry, because all these Falcon 9 similar rockets, the Tianlong 3 made by Space Pioneer and other similar liquid engine rockets will all be launched, I think, by the end of this year. So
I think this year is going to be a big year across the
yeah,
industry, almost irrespective of a country.
yeah.
Well,
So
we'll have
maybe
to
there will
leave it
be.
there. So yeah, Yao Song, thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining us. You're the co-founder, co-CEO of Orionspace, and doing some very interesting things there in Beijing. So thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. That's my pleasure.
Now for Space Takes, where our hosts tackle the buzziest industry topics.
Mike, what do we have going on this week?
All right, let's start with DeepSeek. You've heard of DeepSeek?
I think it's a spiritual trip in Sedona, something like that, right?
It's this new AI app, became the most downloaded AI app on the App Store recently. It's from China, claims to be built for just $6 million. And we're talking about it because there is obviously been a huge movement the last, I don't know, 18 months, 2 years to talk about how AI can help in space. And I think we've seen a lot with autonomous satellites, a lot of ideas there, some ideas with space exploration. And I think the one that's maybe getting the most traction so far is orbital traffic management. You know, when you think, hey, how are we going to handle spacecraft navigation and avoiding crowded orbits, avoiding collisions? That's an area that there's a need for a lot of processing and a lot of data crunching. And so there's this idea that you can use AI to make all this go faster, which is always something people in the space industry want. And if it's working effectively, that maybe you can do it for less, you can do it for cheaper, it can be lighter, it can be faster, and that those are all things that the space industry wants to see.
I think that's on the core, right? The low cost or open source LLM and like how it potentially could sort of revolutionize satellite data processing and, you know, clearly for space exploration. I wonder how the military is actually looking at this.
Yeah, I think that'll be interesting. And you brought up national security. Already we've heard that the NASA has banned DeepSeek over concerns about data privacy and AI security. We know that last month there were reports that some Pentagon computers had tried to use DeepSeek, which is, you know, obviously not something that folks want to do right now with the environment with China. So yeah, I think there will be interest in using AI. I don't know exactly how that's going to play out, and it doesn't sound like it would happen with DeepSeek right away. But we have seen, you know, there are more than a handful of companies that are space companies that are looking for AI. You know, we've seen from Orbital Sidekick, you know, using it to track geospatial data, companies that integrate radar imagery with social media photos. So there's this whole booming industry within the space industry of how to use AI.
Yeah, it's fascinating in terms of what you mentioned earlier, in terms of what's accessible and what's prohibited. It's almost like this TikTok conversation, right? I mean, once it's out there in the commercial space, it's hard to bring the genie back into the bottle, right? And so, like, how that applies both in terms of national defense, corporate intelligence, but also just like some of these broader space exploration missions. You know, I mean, the idea that AI is going to be playing a much more integral role in the development of autonomous spacecraft, whether it's planetary exploration or satellite deployment or, you know, or anything. These types of you know, next gen uses of AI. I wonder what this means in terms of sort of a broader democratization of the space, but also, like, does this lead to sort of the next step in sort of supercharging some of these exploratory efforts?
I think it could, and I think, you know, this will lead into our next topic here. But there's a race going on, right? Like it's easy to say, hey, we're not going to use this, or we're going to do this right now. But there is, you know, I think a race going on with China to see, hey, who can be first to the moon, who can be first to first to go back to the moon, who can be the first to Mars. And so I think there's this push and pull that says, hey, as long as we're on track, that'll work. But, you know, I think if the US starts falling behind on some of these metrics, then it'll be a little bit harder to say, hey, we're not going to use these tools.
I mean, speaking of these lunar exploration programs, we just saw that this week that news that a Pakistani rover will fly on China's Chang'e 8 mission, which is slated for 2028. And, you know, one of the things that maybe is little known about that mission is that it's also expected to have 2 AI-controlled lunar rovers, which is going to be the first time that a Chinese tech subcontractor actually plays a role in this kind of mission. So the interview that we just had with those like Yao Song and frankly even those like DeepSeek founder Liang Wenfeng I mean it's interesting to see this in the context not only of AI integration but also the emergence of this sort of quasi-private sector in what has traditionally been state-run, purely state-run missions, in terms, at least in terms of these broader sort of marquee national prestige goals.
Yeah, and I think, what I was curious about with that story is there is this, pretty significant, pretty substantial coalition that China's building for their lunar missions. And I think it talks about there's, more than a dozen countries, including Russia, that are kind of working on this International Lunar Research Station. And that's a challenge to U.S. leadership and U.S. space exploration, and to see, hey, can you get it done? Who's gonna move first? But I think the second point there is that China has a very clear plan, right? Like they want to have a permanent moon base by the 2030s, which is not that far away, and so they have a real commitment to this sustainable lunar presence.
Yeah, I don't think most people also understand quite the scope of that lunar presence. I mean, by the mid 2030s, like 2035, this lunar station I mean, they've expressed like desire to be able to conduct operations within a 62-mile radius of the lunar South Pole. That is a massive, massive region. And when you talk about sort of finite resources of things like helium-3, which is this sort of non-radioactive isotope that potentially used in this sort of next-gen fusion technology, but more importantly, water, in terms of just using that for both consumption and cooling gears, but also, through electrolysis, you can actually make that into a fuel, and sort of like turning the moon into a little bit of a gas station to explore the rest of the cosmos is really interesting. And I think it's also interesting in the context of where would the U.S. go now? I mean, you haven't heard a ton about Artemis Lunar Base Camp. You've heard a little bit about Gateway, the sort of orbiting lunar station. You've heard questions about sort of the race to the moon. But you've heard this like new conversation, or sort of maybe renewed, maybe not new, but renewed conversation about the primacy of Mars and whether that should be sort of the national prestige goal that is a focus of both the Trump presidency and that which Elon has pushed, and certainly others in that camp.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a soft power angle that
Yeah.
goes along with all of this too. That China is showing how it can work with a whole host of countries that maybe folks did not expect.
Yeah, I think that probably leads us perfectly into our next conversation. And sort of speaking of Mars, this next story, I just kind of love this next story because it reminds me of the kinds of ideas that were maybe emblematic of a different era in space history. Mike, do you want to just kind of do the honors in terms of what's going on here?
No, you take this is yours. You go ahead. I have some thoughts on it though.
All right. So this is a subsidiary of General Atomics, which is a San Diego-based company, has reportedly completed several tests that gear toward the advancement of nuclear thermal propulsion reactor technology, which is basically just a technology that could theoretically one day be used aboard spacecrafts, including human missions to Mars. And I think like the thinking is that Mars is on average about 140 million miles away from Earth. So by current technology standards, I mean, it would take several months to get there. So if you're going to turn Mars into a viable locale for human settlements, one would imagine that you're going to need to start developing the technologies to get there faster.
Right.
So yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think that's what makes it interesting, right? It's a way to go faster on the Autobahn, and it's with that, obviously there's risks, but I think that's obviously something people want to explore. That 4 months, 8 months, that's a really long time. I think the second thing that they've talked about that they're looking at is how do you minimize the amount of radiation that astronauts are exposed to in space. I know that's a big concern. But this is a discussion that's been around for decades, right? And so it's interesting to see some of the technological progress being made here. DARPA has a similar program where they're looking at this type of capability, and they're hoping to launch a demonstrator. I think it's like FY27, so not too far off in the future, but but this is something, like you said, we've heard about for a long time, and now it's starting to get closer and closer to fruition, and you're starting to see, oh, I can see why this would be especially tantalizing right now.
Yeah. It's it not only raises also like international legal questions. Certainly the Outer Space Treaty prohibits the placing of nukes in space, at least in the form of weaponry, which starts to kind of blur the line a little bit when you talk about nuclear reactors, whether it's for power grids on the moon or advanced propulsion systems. But I was digging into this a little bit because it's not a new idea, like you said, and just around the turn or about the middle of the 20th century. There was this Polish-born mathematician who had worked on the Manhattan Project named Stanislaw Ulam, who was really kind of digging into what controlled detonations of like a series of hydrogen bombs behind a spacecraft might look like. And like the idea at that time, which is like, to even think about this is just kind of crazy, but it was to ride this resulting push of high energy photons to achieve essentially like fractions of light speed through the cosmos. And so like you can be forgiven for a little bit if your mind like suddenly conjures those images of Slim Pickens wearing his cowboy hat, like riding,
or kind of Jules Verne-esque.
Yeah, Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. But I mean, it was fascinating in the sense that like rather than sort of rely on these continuous rocket propulsion, like the ship could in theory effectively increase speeds as hydrogen bombs were detonated in a sequence behind the craft. And it even showed up in a 1955 like Defense Department report. So like that's nothing to speak of the fact that like the ship has to not be vaporized in the process. Like this electromagnetic pulse can't fry the craft's circuitry, and like the spew, like you mentioned, the spew of radiation can't kill everybody on board. But it's just interesting to think about some of these old concepts being re-envisioned. Now, I don't think that is the technology being discussed here, but it sort of speaks to like these dream of vision ideas that people, like 80 years ago we're discussing. So.
Right, and that gets us right back to where we started. I think, when we talk about DeepSeek, it's hard to imagine AI having the ability to do any of this. And the same with, 80 years ago, could you imagine AI being able to tell a satellite where to move using predictive analytic?
Yeah.
The future feels very much like, oh, this is the science fiction future we read about.
It seems very HAL, 2001 Space Odyssey. Yeah. All right, that wraps us up.
Space Loop. Let's close the loop with trivia and audience perspective on this week's space news.
All right, on to trivia. Last week's trivia focused on Hubble's discovery that was described as sort of a cosmic bullseye. And the answer, if you were paying attention, is centering on this massive galaxy with 9 star-filled rings, which occurred after a much smaller blue dwarf galaxy basically shot through the heart of it, as if like Cupid were an astronomer here. This would be the arrow that went through its galactic heart. So that 9-star ringed or the multiple ring galaxy is the answer. Okay, this week's trivia. What recent discovery did the Euclid mission, which is a European Space Agency mission that works sort of in tandem with NASA, make in the constellation Draco, which is just about 590 million light years away from Earth? Is it A, a new galaxy, B, a new type of star, or C, an Einstein ring? So the answer, you can pay attention to our channels, or we'll bring it up on the following week's podcast. Mike,
you can take a nuclear powered rocket there, and it won't take quite as long, right?
Exactly.
Great, but we also want to hear from you. If you have feedback about how you think AI is going to change space exploration or how the space industry works, we'd love to hear that. You can shoot us a note at spaceminds@spacenews.com. Thanks for watching this week. I'm Mike Gruss.
And I'm David Ariosto. We'll see you next time on Space Minds.